Well, isn't it a lovely surprise to be invited to come to Cairns in the middle of winter if you live in Armidale? I wasn't about to say no to the invitation to be here, even though if you listened to that intro, I am actually not an expert in enhanced rock weathering, so that was a surprise as well. But I've been invited here today to set the context of why we care about carbon dioxide removal in general, and then the rest of you are going to talk about the details of enhanced rock weathering. And I'm really looking forward to that so that I can learn all about it too. So as I said, I'm here to give you an overview of why we need carbon dioxide removal at all, how we are absolutely going to need it to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, and I'll talk to you about the general context, how it's going in terms of implementing carbon dioxide removal. So I'm sure you're all aware that under the UNFCCC, we now have the Paris Agreement with all countries on board, which is a fantastic development. And the Paris Agreement is aiming to keep temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and preferably no more than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. The Paris Agreement itself has identified that in order to achieve that temperature goal, the world is going to need to reach the point of net zero, that's net zero greenhouse gases, in the second half of the century. You might hear it simplified as the IPCC says you need to get there by 2050. Doesn't quite say that, neither does the Paris Agreement. It says the second half of the century. And net zero is a position when all the emissions of the world are balanced by removals. And that's usually carbon dioxide removal because we're not very good at removing any of the other greenhouse gases yet. The sixth assessment report made this very clear statement in the summary for policymakers. The deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero greenhouse gas emissions is to be achieved. So we can't pretend that we can get there just by focusing on emissions reduction. We are going to have to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere if we're going to meet the temperature goal. The sixth assessment report also defines what they mean by this confusing term carbon dioxide removal. It's confusing in particular to inventory developers because we also use the word removal to simply mean taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. It's just the flux. But when we say carbon dioxide removal, we mean specifically anthropogenic activities that take greenhouse gases, in this case CO2, out of the atmosphere and durably store it somewhere else. Now, this definition doesn't actually define durably, but if you look at the chapter where this definition is introduced, they talk about methods that take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it for decades to centuries or longer. So that's what the IPCC, at least in the AR6, was defining as CDR. And chapter 12, which is where they talked about the need for CDR and the ways to do it sort of more generally, presents this stylised pathway of how to get to net zero. But it also emphasises that there are actually many ways to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, and they don't all follow this trajectory, but this is a typical trajectory. And when this was published in 2022, it actually said that to meet the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, what we need is for emissions to peak before 2025 and then to be halved by 2030 and methane to be reduced by a third by 2030. And then we need to get to a point of net zero CO2 by soon after 2050 and net zero GHG by around about 2070. Clearly, we've missed that boat in terms of peaking emissions before 2025. But we haven't entirely missed the boat for meeting the temperature goal, because the temperature goal is for 2100. So now we have the possibility that we can meet that with overshoot. So we can we're definitely missed the peak, but we can take more CO2 out of the atmosphere and still get the temperature to 1.5 in 2100 with huge effort. So countries around the world have been making pledges about net zero. Ours is one of them. Most of them have pledged to meet net zero by 2050. I had to update this figure, unfortunately, because the last time I used it was a while ago, and it said that there were 140 countries that had net zero commitments, and they covered 85% of global emissions. The withdrawal of the US has made a big difference to the amount of the global emissions that are covered by net zero commitments. Obviously very disappointing. But nevertheless, there's still 139 countries that are committed, and that covers nearly 3/4 of the global emissions. So countries have made those commitments, but companies are also making similar commitments. Down the right-hand side, the race to zero is, it comes through the UNFCCC, whereas the Science-Based Targets Initiative is NGO-driven. Lots and lots of companies around the world have signed up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and have adopted net zero targets, and they've just actually released their version 2 of their standard just a few weeks ago. And to support companies in doing this, there are a couple of standards out there. There's the Greenhouse Gas Protocols standard. This particular one, called the Land Sector and Removal Standard, was worked on for over 5 years and finally made it to publication in January this year. And then there's a standard that's being developed by ISO, the International Standards Organisation for Net Zero Aligned Organisations. And this one, just last week, in fact, released its draft, and that will be open for comment until the end of August. So if people are interested to see that, I can facilitate that. Unfortunately, Standards Australia is not inviting public comment, but the British Standards Institute is. So Australia will be commenting, but we'll be commenting via a small committee, and we're pleased to have input to what we write. Lots of companies, as I said, have adopted targets. Microsoft has been the most vocal, and they are doing the most in terms of buying carbon dioxide removal credits around the world, including biochar credits from Australia. These are the different CDR methods that were reviewed in the AR6. I imagine you're all very familiar with CDR in general, but let's just run through a few of them to make sure. There's the most obvious thing: tree planting, building soil organic matter. Actually, this is one of the reasons why we changed, well, the scientists changed the name. They used to talk about negative emissions technologies, and then they felt that actually planting trees and building soil organic matter are not really technologies. They're things that people have done forever in agriculture and forestry. So that's how they came to introduce this term carbon dioxide removal instead. Then there are more advanced ways of doing it, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. If you grow plants, you burn them and capture energy from them, but also capture the flue gases and inject that underground. You have a negative emissions process. Or making biochar out of biomass. You're probably familiar with biochar. Certainly some people in this room are very familiar with biochar. But in case you're not, heating biomass in a low or no oxygen environment where you create essentially a charcoal-like product which has very stable carbon. And we call it biochar when you put it into soil or other applications where it can't be combusted and returned to atmosphere, like putting it in roads or concrete. Enhanced weathering is on the list, and that's of course the focus of our conference, so I won't talk any more about that. And then the other one that I guess is getting a lot of attention is direct air carbon capture and storage, which essentially means sucking ambient air across a solvent and capturing the CO2 that way, condensing it and injecting that underground. And there are a couple of ocean-based methods. One is putting nutrients in the ocean to encourage algal growth, which then takes CO2 out of the atmosphere when it grows, and then it's supposed to die and sink to the bottom. Some ecologists are rather concerned about that approach. And then there's ocean alkalinity enhancement, which you probably know about too, and is seen as possibly really useful for the barrier reef, for example. Now, in the AR6, we talked about how to classify the different CDR methods, and we came up with this taxonomy. So it's based on classifying the removal process. How is the CO2 captured from the atmosphere? And so there's biological, if it involves photosynthesis, and there's geochemical. In the case of enhanced weathering, we identified that one as obviously being a geochemical process and involving a mineral storage component, whereas the other storage options were in vegetation, soil, and then in marine sediments and geological formations. So in the case of biochar, you have the biological process that takes the carbon out of the atmosphere in the first place. Then it is stored in vegetation or soils. And in the case of BECCS, you have it captured in the plant, but then stored geologically. The chapter summarises the various contexts for the different CDR methods. They all have their different opportunities and challenges. Risk of reversal is really important when we're talking about soil carbon and vegetation. Life cycle emissions is important for enhanced weathering. Enhanced weathering involves crushing rock and transporting it, and both of these involve energy. So we do need to think about the net carbon dioxide removal after you've taken life cycle emissions into consideration. Some of the methods are very new, like DAX and ocean alkalinity enhancement, and some things we've been doing for a long time, like planting trees and building soil organic matter. Some of the methods have synergies, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about synergies between enhanced weathering and agricultural productivity. Some of them have sustainability concerns. Somebody put together the estimates of the land that would be required to meet the highest emissions scenario that was modelled in the special report on 1.5. And the only CDR methods that they included in the scenarios back then were planting trees or BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So what they modelled was the amount of arable land in the world that would be occupied by biomass crops if your source of CDR was BECCS. It was half the area of arable crops. So people started getting very concerned about the potential sustainability issues if people were going to be relying on bio-based methods such as BECCS to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. This figure comes from the recently released third edition of the State of CDR report. And I thought it might be helpful just for a moment to talk about what is CDR and what isn't. If you do DAX, you're taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and you're putting it underground and it's going to stay there a long time. So that definitely meets the definition of an anthropogenic process and durable storage, and it takes the CO2 from the atmosphere. If, on the other hand, you were to take the CO2 that you'd captured in your DAC plant and turn that into a fuel and then burn it, the CO2 will be back in the atmosphere quite soon, so that would not meet the definition. If you had a fossil fuel-fired power station and you captured the CO2 there, you'd be avoiding those emissions, but you're not taking the CO2 from the atmosphere. So even if you put that CO2 underground, that's not CDR because the carbon was not derived from the atmosphere. Similarly, trees growing out there naturally in unmanaged environments, taking CO2 from the atmosphere doesn't meet the definition of an anthropogenic removal, whereas trees that have been planted by people for this purpose does. So I just mentioned this third edition of the State of CDR report. These are really useful if you're in the land of CDR policy in particular. It's a snapshot of what's happening in the world in relation to our understanding of costs and potentials of the different CDR methods, of what's happening in terms of R&D and investments in R&D, and also what's happening with policies and how we're going in actually deploying these methods. So I've got a few slides based on this. Very handy, it was just published at the beginning of this month. This is their look across the literature. So the literature on CDR has exploded, and most of the explosion has been in biochar. So the brown parts of the bars are the biochar research. It's kind of stabilised in the last 2 years, but that's where most of the growth has been. The enhanced weathering is actually the little dark red part. So, hang on, I think if I do that, does that work? I don't know how this pointer works, sorry. No, you said that was the pointer there? Aha, thank you. Okay, so that's the biochar, you probably found it, but you might have missed the enhanced weathering. It's this little dark reddy colour down here. So the literature on that has not really grown. There's plenty of opportunity for you all to get involved in that, I'm sure, in changing that. This is their assessment of the latest literature on costs and potentials. Now, potential is a difficult word. What they have plotted here is technical potential, and by technical potential, they mean the potential under biophysical constraints, but also considering availability of technologies and practices. But when they say availability, they don't mean it's already been deployed, they mean that we know how to do it. So we know how to do it. It's theoretically possible, essentially. And you'll see that the biggest bars here are for the DAX and the ocean alkalinity enhancement, which are considered to be essentially, I keep losing this pointer, these are considered to be essentially unlimited from a theoretical perspective. Plenty of other limitations, but you could do lots of it, at least theoretically. Whereas some of the other methods are not nearly so prospective, and enhanced weathering is down here with a rather small little bar. It's about 4 gigatons. Over here we have the costs, and the costs of doing things like DAX are probably very high. Even in the long term, most people who are experts in DAX are not expecting the costs to come down anywhere near where they are for soil carbon and planting trees. On the other hand, the range of costs for enhanced weathering is much lower and tends to be on the lower end of the spectrum. So that's promising for that technology. But essentially what we know is that we're going to need a portfolio of CDR methods. All of these have some role to play, and all of them have some constraints that we need to bear in mind as well. In Australia, the main way we encourage emissions reduction and carbon sequestration activities is through our ACCU scheme, where we pay people carbon credits, essentially, to undertake activities that we know are beneficial for the climate. This is the list of project types from a little while ago. Some of them have been withdrawn, and there's some others that have come in that I haven't got on the list yet, so just excuse me for inaccuracies in this one. But you will see that the first 3 are carbon dioxide removal, and the rest are emissions reduction. We don't have anything much in the way of carbon dioxide removal in the ACCU scheme at the moment when we're talking about the novel methods. In fact, we don't have any of these novel methods there yet. And there are a few constraints about that, which we could talk about in detail later. But it is an opportunity. In order to have a method accepted in the ACCU scheme, these are the integrity criteria that it needs to be able to satisfy. It needs to be able to, you need to be certain that the science behind it is valid. There's enough of an evidence base to prove that it is going to be a method that delivers mitigation, but also that we know enough about it to be able to quantify how much mitigation it will deliver. It needs to be something that wasn't going to happen anyway, so that's the word additionality. It should not be a BAU practice, something that everyone was about to adopt anyway, because we certainly don't want to be spending money buying credits for something someone was going to do anyway. It's a waste of our dollars, and it doesn't actually add to taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere or reducing emissions. One of the difficult ones has been the eligible in terms of supports Australia's mitigation commitments. And we have a constraint there, because what countries include in their national greenhouse gas inventories is what is in the IPCC's guidelines for countries creating those inventories. And it does not have novel CDR in it. Apart from an optional chapter on biochar in the AFLU chapter, optional appendix on biochar, which only Japan has implemented so far as far as I understand. But we are in the middle of rectifying this. The IPCC has started to write the methodology report on CDR. It will cover the novel CDR methods, and it will be a supplement to the 2006 guidelines, which is the 2019 guidelines are already a supplement to the 2006 guidelines. So we're in the middle of doing that, and it's due to be published by the end of next year. It's a circuitous process. First of all, its scope is approved, and then its lead authors are approved. We've had the first meeting. We'll have another one in Mexico in August. And we have to write this report really fast because it has to go through rounds of expert and government review before it's due to be published by the end of next year. But the voluntary carbon market has gone out ahead of governments, and it has several methods available under several different platforms for enhanced rock weathering and lots of other methods for various other carbon dioxide removal methods. I've nearly finished. This is back to the state of CDR, how we're going and actually deploying it. Well, in fact, over 99% of carbon credits related to delivered carbon dioxide removal are from the conventional methods, mostly associated with vegetation management, including avoided deforestation. Novel CDR is tiny, but it is going up really fast, and it's actually the majority of credits that are being traded at the moment because most credits are actually forward commitments. I won't go into this in detail, But this large yellow bar is the forward commitments. This is the amount of actual delivered, tiny as I say. But it's ramping up. People are really interested in buying removal credits for what they see as permanent and what they see as offering co-benefits. Just looking really quickly at the scenarios and how they model the future, and the enhanced weathering is actually showing up. This is 8 different integrated assessment models. The enhanced weathering is showing up here in many of the models for how CDR may be deployed in the future. But the main message of the third edition of the State of CDR is that the gap is growing between the amount of CDR that's going to be needed, because unfortunately we keep putting more emissions into the atmosphere. So we're going to need more CDR, but our pledges are too small and the rate of deployment is too slow. So they say the next 5 years are critical in terms of building the confidence and building the knowledge base so that we can have the CDR that we're going to need in place when we need it to get to net zero. So that's the end of my story. There's plenty of recognition of the importance of CDR. There's lots of initiatives out there to encourage people to do it. There's methodologies to show them how to do it, and the IPCC is now getting on board, so watch out for the opportunities to comment on that report as it's developed over the next year. Happy to answer any questions by email if you'd like to know more about it.